So if you watch my video on how I study,
What?
that's more how I study for some memorization-based courses, but more courses that like you can get by on just repeated passes of content and using the whiteboard method, which I talked about more in that video. So if you want to learn more about that, you can watch that video. But in this video, I'm going to talk about how my study technique has kind of differed for these two classes and how I have gone about studying for these two classes, with more emphasis on molecular biology, because this study technique that I have developed for this class, tried and true, it has worked for both exams that I have taken for the class. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the video. So the first thing for molecular biology is passes of content. Since it's a lot of material and a lot of it is very detailed, very specific to the course, not so much applicable outside of the molecular biology realm. So that's why passes of content is, in my opinion, the most helpful thing you can do to pass and do well in exams and such in this course. But what are passes of content? Passive content is literally just exposing yourself to the material as much as possible. So reading the textbook, watching YouTube videos, looking at articles online, talking with the professor about concepts that you find difficult, taking notes, creating study guides, making flashcards, making Anki. Like, all of those are passes of content because you're exposing yourself more and more to the stuff that is going to be on your exam. So how I do it, I'll go to how I would ideally study and how I actually study. So we'll start with ideal first. So ideally, I would read the textbook, read the chapter that we're going to talk about in class before we actually go to class. So I would read that textbook and come to class already having a rough idea of what we're going to talk about in the class. Then I would go to class and I have all of the PowerPoints downloaded on my iPad, and then I would just be annotating the slides in class as the professor is lecturing. I would just be adding in any information that I feel like the professor emphasizes, adding in anything that the professor, goes over a lot, adding in my own notes, like maybe he said something that wasn't exactly on the slide, so I want to add it onto the slides. That's what I would do during class. And also during class, I have a separate notebook that I title potential exam questions, because you'd be surprised, or at least I thank God for my professor, that he does casually mention, drop hints of what he is going to test on in the exam. So he'll mention that, oh yeah, he's definitely going to ask a question about this, or he'll even say word for word what the question would look like differentiating between eukaryotic and prokaryotic transcription and translation. Directly in class, he will drop that and say, I'm going to ask a question about this. So instead of including that in my notes, and then when I'm trying to study for the exam, trying to differentiate between what my notes are and what he said, I just have a separate notebook on my iPad in GoodNotes. Love GoodNotes down. Albeit all the scandals, we're not gonna talk about that. So I just have a separate notebook where I put any potential exam questions that either he mentioned or I'm reading it and going through and I'm like, yeah, he's definitely gonna ask about this. And sometimes I've been right, sometimes I've been wrong, but a lot of the times I've been right, and this is helpful to just have a whole separate notebook where I write just these questions. Then after class, ideally, immediately after class, I would go in and start creating the study guide for that chapter. So my study guides for molecular biology are very detailed and very long. For instance, my study guide for exam 1 was 43 pages in GoodNotes, which is a lot. What I do is I literally write, not word for word, but the important stuff from these slides. I write them in my study guide, and then I will tape out the stuff that I need to memorize. And then literally just going back and going through this, untaping, retaping as I'm studying. So it's kind of a form of active studying because I'm forced to recall if I actually know the information in the document or not. And then I just repeat this as much as possible as I'm studying for the exam. And then I also do the same thing for the chapters in the textbook if that was specifically emphasized. So in chapter 1, I did this where I went into the textbook and I also added in information that was in the textbook but wasn't in our lecture slides, and I had memorized a bit of that with this taping method. But for the most recent exam 2, I didn't do this, and I got a better score on my exam. But I think it's because exam 2, there was just a lot of information in the textbook, and the professor was more worried about us knowing like the general scheme and the main ideas rather than knowing like the specific nitty-gritties or like the many details and examples that the textbook went into, if that makes sense. So it is a bit of trial and error, but anyways, going back to my ideal. So ideally, I do that immediately after class. Then I would ideally, continue this, rinse and repeat repeat for every chapter and every lecture, you know, reading the textbook, going to class, studying, creating the study guide on that chapter immediately after class. And then in the week before the exam, ideally I would start studying a week before the exam. I would devote a day to really going into each chapter. So ideally I would use my whiteboard method that I talked about in my last How I Study video, my most recent How I Study video. And I would use that whiteboard method to really make sure that I know everything from each chapter, and I'd spend a day going over each chapter individually. And then usually I only have about 4, maybe 5 chapters for an exam. So I would spend the last day of that week going over like the similarities between the chapters. So trying to find connections between chapters is a really great way to study, because a lot of the times professors love to quiz on the connections between chapters or connections between key concepts. So that is what I would ideally do the last day. But in reality, let me tell you what I have done for this class specifically in the past. So for molecular biology, for the first exam, I started studying probably about maybe 4 days before the exam, but I really only really hammered in like last 3 days before the exam. So what I did was I created my study guide like I was telling you guys with the whole taping method, and I kind of ran out a bit of time towards the end of my studying, and this is where I had to like go in and just like take screenshots or copy and paste the slides and then tape onto the slides themselves. But for me, writing everything out really helps ingrain it into my head, and this is what I ideally would do. But sometimes, you know, if you run out of time, it's okay. I copied and pasted the slides and then still used the taping method on top of that, and it was fine. But just ideally I would have time to write everything out, because writing it is really how I memorize it and I make sure that I know what I'm talking about and I can answer any question that comes up. So I did this, and then literally the night before the exam I was just hammering this in. Oh, I forgot to mention also, in my study guides I also rewrite and redo all of the quiz questions that are associated with the exam that we have. So for instance, for exam 1 we had chapters 1, 2, 3 quizzes, and our exam was from chapters 1 to 4. So I hand wrote, key word, hand wrote. I didn't just like copy paste or print. I know some people do that, but for me the best way for me to study is hand writing all of the questions. And I know it's tedious, it takes a lot of time.
What to ask yourself is,
my hand was definitely cramped up, but it helped me. I did well on the exam. So I hand wrote all the quiz questions, and then before I went in and did like my active recall with the taping method. I redo all of the quiz questions without looking at my notes or anything. Like I redo it like in an exam-like environment where I don't have notes, I don't have access to any other extra material, so I do it kind of like it's an exam. And then I go back in and I check my work, and sometimes I would do just as well as I did when I did the quiz with my notes and extra material. Other times I would miss questions, and this is where I can highlight kind of my weaker areas in those specific chapters, so I can say, oh yeah, this concept is still confusing me, or I'm confusing these two different topics together. So then when I'm doing my active recall studying, I can kind of hammer in on those parts that like when I was doing the quiz I was missing them again, or I was missing them like without any extra reference. So then when I'm studying, I hammer that in and I focus less so on the stuff that I know like off the top of my head, like I don't even really need to study it per se. So I did this for the first exam, and really it was just a lot of cramming. It was a lot of cramming, but for memorization based courses, more passive material, and really for me what helps is doing my studying as close to the exam as possible. It really helps me do well in the exam, I think.
Well. Next question. See ya.
If I start studying earlier, maybe I won't have to cram. I'm doing it for this third exam. I already started studying for it. So hopefully that means that like the night before the exam, I won't really be cramming so much. I'll just be doing light review of everything. But it helps for me personally to have a good review session the day before the exam. And then, yeah, I just literally rinse and repeat this for every exam. So I did this for exam 2, or exam 1 and exam 2. My exam 2 study guide was a little shorter. It was 31 pages, but it's still a lot. Like 31 pages is still a lot. But this like type of studying I think has been super duper helpful for me. And so I apply this same technique or idea in biochemistry, which at first biochemistry was not common sense, but review, because my biochem professor decided to spend like the first exam part of the course like talking about review and things like that you'll need to know to understand for later on in the course, like talking about like, you know, rate law and polarity and moles and functional groups and spontaneity and intramolecular versus hydrophobic, acid-base titrations, all of the stuff that we have gone over before in other courses like organic chemistry, like general chemistry. So it really wasn't, the only additional thing in this was like amino acids and then amino acid titration curves and then like PI, isoelectric weight. Those were kind of like newer stuff, but most of it was review. But still, to study, what I have been doing for biochem is, luckily, so my biochem professor is amazing, love him down. He has, so before every quiz, he'll like provide us like a list essentially of what we need to know going into the quiz to do well on the quiz. And then I will use that like list and I will create questions and kind of quiz myself off of that list and like write the answers to every question based off of the list he's provided. And then for exams, he has exam recitations. So in lab, we will have like a recitation thing that we will do, which is like kind of a simulated exam, but usually it's all multiple choice, while our real exams are like half multiple choice, some short answer, and then some essay. So the exam isn't completely like that, but at least you know if you can answer all of the multiple choice questions in his recitation, you kind of know what you're talking about. And then in the exam recitation, he also has like lists of topics and stuff that he thinks are important for you to know. So I really hammer this in. And recently we had a quiz that was not going to be multiple choice, so I had to come back to my tape method from molecular to help me hone in on stuff so that I was able to regurgitate it in the quiz without looking at my notes or anything like that. So I used the tape method to help me study and really hone in on a lot of specific details and things that I just had to memorize. So I recently did this and I think I did well on the quiz. We'll see what my score is, because you know when you're doing an exam or a quiz that's not multiple choice, it does take the professor a little bit more time to go in and grade the exam. Really, again, like with the passes of content, it's just giving yourself as much time with the material as possible. So especially when you have exams that are testing a lot of content, like 4 chapters worth of content is a lot. And if the first time that you're getting passes of content outside of going to lecture is like 3 days before the exam, you might struggle a little bit, or you might be cramming like I was. But if you know, give yourself a little bit more time and try to study a little bit every day, that's kind of, I think, the takeaway from this video, I hope, is that you study a little bit every day. You know, you study for 30 minutes or an hour this day, and then the next day you study for like 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then the next day you study for an hour or 2, and you're just getting more time with the material. Then you'll do better on the exam just because you're so much more familiar with the stuff. And as always, for memorization based courses especially, like don't be afraid to reach out with the professor and like make sure that what you're memorizing is on par with what the professor wants you to memorize. Because the caveat, the bad thing about memorization-based courses is that usually when professors are looking for answers, they're looking for very specific verbiage and wording. So you have to make sure that what you're memorizing is actually on key, on par with what the professor wants you to memorize. Like just little nuances in vocabulary that you want to make sure that you're memorizing the right thing and you're not memorizing something that's completely off track. Because I feel like with multiple choice questions, you can kind of get away with just knowing the general concept of an idea and knowing how to differentiate that with what is right versus what is wrong. But with memorization based courses where you're going to be asked to like regurgitate some topic or explain something, there's usually like some keywords that professors are looking for. So that's why I highly recommend that you talk with your professor continually, like not just like right before the exam, but make sure you're asking questions in class, make sure you're going in their office hours if you need help, make sure that you know you're really doing your best and putting your best foot forward. And I've said this in videos past, but I'm going to say it again, is that professors are, you know, they're humans and they're people, and they understand that like if you're coming and you're putting your best foot forward and you're showing that you really are trying to do well in this course, professors are generally like nicer, and I'm coming in and say they are grade more lenient when they know that you're putting in the work. But if they don't know that you're putting in the work, they're gonna grade your exam like any other exam. But if you've been asking questions in class, showing up to their office hours, emailing them about specific questions, you know, like really showing the professor that you care about this class and you're doing your best and you're trying your best and you're putting in the time and effort that they want to see, when they're coming to grade your exam or your quiz or whatever, they're going to be nicer. So that's just a little tip. I've noticed, me personally, I don't know about y'all, but I've noticed that professors are just generally nicer when they see that you're putting in the effort. But yeah, okay, I've talked too much. I've talked a lot, but I hope this video was helpful. And if it was, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below. I respond to every single comment, and subscribe if you want to see more videos from me. So yeah, thanks. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.